In 2018, Insomniac Games released one of the greatest superhero games of all time, Marvel's Spider-Man for the PlayStation 4. Loved by fans and critics alike, it spawned a sequel and a remaster just 2 years later, and the series would go on to sell 33 million copies by June of 2022. Insomniac's take on the franchise felt both fresh and familiar, breathing new life into the classic character.
New suit, same old me.
It came out last week on PC, and if you haven't played it yet, I highly recommend it. I've beat it regularly and on New Game Plus, I've 100%ed it, I've gotten every achievement in the main game and the DLC, and I can confidently say that it is not the best Spider-Man game of all time. That title belongs to its sequel, Spider-Man Miles Morales. Miles Morales didn't get as much of the hype as its predecessor, which I think is partly due to the fact that it was a launch title for the PlayStation 5. It was only one part of the conversation that included big hitters like Demon's Souls, Sackboy: A Big Adventure, Astro's Playroom, and Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, which was included in the deluxe version of Spider-Man Miles Morales. Aside from the obvious differences between the two games, like their protagonists and their respective stories, the main difference between the two Spider-Man games is their size. Marvel's Spider-Man can be completed in about 20 hours, while its sequel, Miles Morales, can be completed in about half the time. But make no mistake, Miles Morales is not a better game in spite of its size, but because of it, and every decision Insomniac made to cut the original down was for the better, creating a polished, tighter experience. The story of Marvel's Spider-Man is a solid, straightforward superhero experience. After defeating Kingpin, the crime boss that ruled over New York City, Spider-Man has to deal with new threats that emerge to fill the power vacuum. It's a smart move on Insomniac's part because it gives them a viable reason for Spider-Man to face off against a classic lineup of villains like Rhino, Electro, and the Vulture. The opening sequence is especially strong because it drops players right into the action and showcases all of the core elements of gameplay. You swing through the city, which feels great, and head straight to your first combat encounter. There are plenty of moves and gadgets you'll unlock later in the game, but these first fights still have all the mechanics that make fighting as Spider-Man so fun. It's fast-paced and fluid. The way you're able to effortlessly spring around the battlefield and dodge enemy attacks is impressive game design in a dozen different ways. Once you've defeated a few waves of goons, you come face to face with Kingpin himself and end the opening sequence with a brutal boss fight. Despite that core gameplay loop being so solid, Marvel's Spider-Man's main missions have you dabbling in a series of unrelated, less heroic game modes. The most notorious of which are the stealth sections where you play as Mary Jane Watson or Miles Morales, neither of which have any powers. Narratively, they're great characters and great additions to the story, but mechanically, they're just not that fun to play as. They're slow and don't have a lot of options to deal with their problems, which is the opposite of how it feels to play as Spider-Man. There are also a few puzzle minigames you can do as Peter Parker in his job at the lab, where either you match lines to figure out an object's chemical composition, or you move some tiles around to balance an electrical flow. It's not really a bad mode in the same way that the stealth modes are, but it's definitely unnecessary, like it could have been replaced with a few cutscenes. These recurring sections are blemishes on an otherwise solid campaign. They're modes born out of a desire to add content to the game, but Insomniac failed to make that content meaningful or engaging. What's the point of adding hours of gameplay to a story when I don't even want to play them? Spider-Man Miles Morales has none of this. No lab puzzles, no mandatory stealth sections, nothing. The closest it comes is a late game sequence where Miles and Finn need to get into a museum to see their exhibit, but it's a lot more justified this time around. You get context and an important plot point, it's a one-off event, and there's no fail states, so you won't have to play the same section over and over again, like if you were playing as MJ and kept getting caught. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a lot like the opening sequence of the first game. When you have a limited amount of time to grab a player's attention, you just want to show them the greatest hits. Miles Morales doesn't include unnecessary story missions or mechanics, and the game feels more focused as a result. While their story modes are different lengths, the Spider-Man games share an equally sized open world. As soon as you're free from the opening sequence, the game allows you to swing around and explore to your heart's content. Story is important, but my personal Spider-Man experience has always been defined by this free roam open world. Pardon the cliche, but swinging around and stopping crimes really makes you feel like Spider-Man. As you play through the main missions, you'll unlock collectibles and side quests to complete throughout the city. Populating an open world with things to do is, of course, super important, otherwise what's all that space for? While the events themselves vary in quality, this is another point that Spider-Man Miles Morales just does better. The main flaw of the collectibles in the original Spider-Man is their poor narrative justification. Aside from the crimes that pop up every few minutes as you swing around, most of the collectibles don't actually make a ton of logical sense. I know it's a game about a superpowered spider person, but my suspension of disbelief can only take me so far. For example, one of the first things you have to do in the open world is unlock police towers that have been hacked by some kind of server attack. As you connect to them, you're able to see more of the map, but why wouldn't Spider-Man already have a map of the city in his system? GPS isn't down, just the police communication towers. Aside from the towers, one of the main collectibles are the backpacks. Peter stashed them around the city in his younger days, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense why he'd only be able to detect them now. He made a point to attach tracking dots to all of them, but didn't have a way to look for them before hooking himself up to the police towers. Also, there's like 50 backpacks across the whole city. How did the famously broke Parker family buy that many backpacks? There's an easy answer to all these questions. You're just not supposed to think about it. Towers and backpacks are included because they make the story better. They're included because those are just the types of things you're supposed to include in an open world video game. Why is Spider-Man taking photos of landmarks in a city he's lived in his whole life? Well, because it's a video game, and the player's probably not as familiar with the city. Why did Harry Osborn and his mom set up like a dozen science stations on rooftops across the city? Well, because it's a video game, and now that can be a new type of side mission. Yes, the world is filled with things to do, but they're not included because they serve the story or because they're particularly novel gameplay mechanics. They're included because Insomniac set out to make an open world game, and these are just conventions of the genre.
Already regretting this.
While Spider-Man Miles Morales doesn't avoid these pitfalls entirely, as a whole, its collectibles just make more sense. They feel natural, and not like the game is bending over backwards to populate the open world with things to grab. For example, backpacks have been replaced with time capsules, little boxes that Miles and his friend Finn deliberately hid around the city. Miles didn't just forget about sticking them in weird places. The entire purpose of a time capsule is to hide something to be found later. It's still kind of an unreasonable amount of items to be hidden all over the city, but at least it makes more sense in the backpacks. The lengthier side quests have been replaced by the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man app, which New Yorkers can use to request Miles' help. The app's existence is a little unrealistically convenient, but it makes more sense to me than Peter landing on a random rooftop and finding a guy that needs help collecting his 5 pigeons. At least Miles gets his pigeon request through an app.
Howard? Oh, pigeon guy. Pete told me about him.
The Friendly Neighborhood side quests are some of my favorites because of how they develop Miles' relationship with his city. He genuinely cares about the people of Harlem, enough to help someone clean ice off a crane or help someone find their lost cat.
Spider-Man!
As a result of this, Miles actually feels like he's a part of the open world. It's a city he's lived in, one that reaches out and responds when he does something to help them. This is also true in the game's story, where Miles is caught in the middle of a battle for Harlem. On one side is Roxxon, an evil energy corporation that wants to exploit Harlem for profit, and on the other side is the Underground, an extremist gang bent on destroying Roxxon even if Harlem is lost in the process. Miles' position is firmly in defense of his neighborhood, and it's not just believable because of his actions during cutscenes, but because of his actions in the open world as well. When I say Spider-Man Miles Morales is a more focused experience, this is what I'm talking about. Its story and mechanics aren't as expansive as the game that came before it, but they're intertwined in such a way that the game becomes more than the sum of its parts. Because the game is driven by theme more than convention, it's a more satisfying experience. Of all the changes from Insomniac's first Spider-Man to Miles Morales, the changes to combat are the ones I appreciate the most. As a whole, the mechanics in Spider-Man Miles Morales are more in line with the series' combat philosophy, and the mechanics it adds build off of existing ideas rather than inventing new ones. That said, combat in Marvel's Spider-Man is already fantastic and one of the game's greatest strengths. Spider-Man is effortlessly elegant, flipping and thwipping at the player's command. The animations are beautiful, but you always have full control over Spider-Man's movements. As someone used to the clunky beat-em-up style of the Spider-Man games of the past, it's shockingly smooth. The thing that makes it feel so intuitive is the fact that the player has so many options, and those options can be used at any time with extreme ease. Tapping square is a normal attack, but holding square launches an enemy into the air. Dodging away from an enemy triggers a backflip, but dodging towards an enemy allows you to vault over or slide under them. You can also cancel attacks. Press triangle to web strike and pull yourself across the battlefield, but press circle and you can cancel that move and dodge instead. Like any good combat system, once you've got the controls down, you enter a state of flow. It's a state of flow that's easy to get into because the inputs are so simple. You're acting, reacting, and predicting all in real time. It's kind of like an improvised jazz solo. In jazz, you have a key you need to stay in and a tempo you have to stick to, but the notes and rhythms are all yours to decide. To me, combat in Spider-Man feels similar. There's a limited set of actions you can take, and you have to defeat all the enemies, but the way you go about it is fully freeform and improvised. Taking damage is like playing a wrong note. It's jarring at first, but if you get back into the swing of things quickly enough, you'll be so caught up in playing that you'll forget about it entirely. The only mechanic that disrupts this flow state are the gadgets. As you play through the game, you'll unlock new tools like the web bomb or electric web that you can use in combat to get the upper hand. It's incredibly helpful, especially when it comes to crowd control, but in order to use them, you have to open up the gadget wheel and slow the game down, exiting the beautiful breakneck combat. It's like if the jazz soloist had to take a measure or two to double check his music to make sure he was playing the right part. It's not terrible, but it pulls you out of the experience, even if it's only slightly.
This is a character sheet from Dungeons and Dragons.
Spider-Man Miles Morales has half the gadgets, effectively replacing them with electrical abilities Miles has called Venom powers. They largely serve the same purpose as gadgets, except they're integrated into combat incredibly well. Just hold a bumper and tap a button to execute them. It's as accessible as a swing kick or a web strike, and to use one, you never have to exit your state of focus. To continue the jazz metaphor, Venom powers are like licks, which are little musical excerpts a jazz soloist memorizes and can insert into any piece they're soloing on. Instead of pausing to check the exact right key and play the exact right notes, you can lean on a reliable riff to help you get back into that flow state. The Venom powers themselves aren't that different from each other. It's an electric punch, or an electric slam, or an electric dash, but because they're integrated so cleanly into the control scheme, it just makes more sense for the combat system than rooting through a gadget wheel to pull out an impact web or a spider drone. Spider-Man Miles Morales has fewer gadgets than its predecessor, but the one mechanic they were replaced by just feels so much more impactful. Just like the story missions or the open world, condensing the content of the first game led to a better mechanic in its sequel. With Marvel's Spider-Man, Insomniac had to make a modern AAA game featuring one of the world's most popular characters. And make no mistake, that was a test they passed with flying colors. It's a gorgeous game with a great story and fantastic combat. But Insomniac deserves just as much praise, if not more, for the follow-up game that sanded away the rough edges and polished the formula into something truly special. Spider-Man Miles Morales is everything the first game wanted to be and more in a smaller, more satisfying package. If you're playing Marvel Spider-Man for the first time on PC this week, you're gonna have a great time. Just keep that enthusiasm ready for Miles when his game comes to PC later this year. Hey there, thanks for watching this video. Fanbyte doesn't really do video essays, but as my internship comes to a close, I was allowed to do a personal project, and this is what I wanted to do. So thanks Fanbyte for letting me make this, and thanks again to you for watching. If you want to see more of me, you can find me on twitter.com @chuckduck365. If you want to see more of Fanbyte, you can sub to this channel, sub to our VODs channel, check us out on Twitch, or just go to fanbyte.com for that gamer goodness. That's not our slogan, but now I think it should be. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.